Hi, everyone, and welcome back. In our last class, we focused on primates more broadly. We talked about what it means to be a primate at all. Grasping hands, feet, forward facing eyes, large brains relative to body size, and rich, complicated social lives. Today, we're narrowing in on one particular branch of that primate tree, which is our own. We're going to spend this lecture with early hominins, the ancient relatives that sit on our side of the split from chimpanzees and bonobos. So here we go. So just so you know, we're working from chapter 5 of the Exploring Our World textbook, which is all about how anthropologists characterize early hominins, how we make sense of fossil bones and stone tools, and how we turn them into a story about where humans come from. This chapter is doing a few things at once, and I want you to have those goals in mind right from the start. First, it asks, what makes a hominin a hominin? In other words, what specific anatomical and behavioral traits distinguish our lineage from other great apes? Second, it walks you through the major evolutionary trends that show up time and time again as we move from the earliest possible hominins to later members of the genus Homo. Third, it introduces the big characters in our deep time story. From Sahelanthropus, sorry guys, there's a lot of difficult pronunciations in this chapter and in this lecture, so if I butcher a couple of them, you'll have to forgive me. So, Sahelanthropus, and Ardipithecus, and Australopithecus, as well as early Homo. And it connects them to changing tool technologies. Finally, it zooms out and it asks, how did our own species, Homo sapiens, emerge from this very crowded cast of characters? That's where the different models of modern human origins, which we'll talk about, their replacement, multi-regional, and assimilation, that's where they come in. All of this ties pretty directly right back to our course objectives. And one of our core goals is that you'll be able to explain how anthropologists use scientific evidence to understand human variation and human evolution. Another goal or objective is that you become comfortable thinking about humans as one species among many, shaped by evolutionary processes rather than sitting somehow outside of them. So today's lecture is a deep dive into all of that. We're going to treat fossil bones as well as teeth and stone tools as data that we can analyze to reconstruct the past. And as we move through this material, I want you to resist the temptation to imagine a simple straight line of ancestors sort of marching up towards us. Resist that. And instead, I want you to picture a family bush, a tangle of branches, some of which continue and some of which end. Our task as anthropologists is to trace that bush as carefully as we can and ask, what changed? Why did it change? And what does that tell us about what it means to be human? Before we start naming species, we need to get our terminology straight because this vocabulary is going to come up in your reading quiz and again later in the semester. So, anthropologists use two related but distinct terms, hominid, ending with a D, and hominin, ending with an N. These sound almost identical, which is extremely annoying, but they do different jobs. In current usage, hominids, ending with a D, are members of the great ape family, Hominini. That family includes 4 living genera: pongo, or orangutans, gorilla, pan, which includes chimpanzees and bonobos, and homo, or us, plus their close extinct relatives. So if you say hominid, you are talking about the larger great ape umbrella. Hominins, on the other hand, are a narrower group. Hominins are modern humans and all of our closest extinct relatives after the split with the chimpanzee lineage. In other words, if you imagine the human chimp ancestor way back in time, hominins are everything on our side of that split. Australopithecus, Paranthropus, early Homo, Neanderthals, and so on, up through us. You'll sometimes see older textbooks that use hominid where we would now say hominin. So if you stumble across that anywhere else in your life and in other readings, just note that the terminology has shifted. And for this course, we're going to stick with the more up-to-date convention, where hominid equals great apes broadly, and hominin equals humans and our direct fossil cousins. The group of anthropologists who focus on these ancient hominins are called paleoanthropologists. Paleoanthropology is the study of origins and the development of early humans and their ancestors, and it's deeply interdisciplinary. Paleoanthropologists draw on biology, anatomy, geology, chemistry, genetics, and primatology to interpret their evidence. They look at fossils, at the rock layers that those fossils came from, at the chemical signatures in the bones and the teeth, at the behavior of living primates, all to reconstruct how early hominins lived, moved, and ate. The fossil record that we're dealing with is, and we should note this, it's extremely fragmentary. Between roughly 8 and 2.5 million years ago, we mostly have bones and teeth. We have no soft tissue, no behavior caught on video, just bits of skeleton. That's why bones matter so much in biological anthropology. Human biologists and osteologists are trained to read tiny details of shape and wear on a bone. The angle of a femur, the thickness of tooth enamel, the position of a hole at the base of the skull. Each of those details becomes a clue about how an animal moved, what it ate, and what kinds of environments it lived in. So with that scattered fossil record, we see a set of recurring evolutionary trends. These trends, they're not like one big switch that flips all at once, though. Instead, they appear in a sort of mosaic pattern, which is to say that some traits show up earlier in one lineage, whereas others appear later in another lineage. The key trends we're going to track today are the evolution of habitual bipedalism, meaning walking on two legs as the primary way of getting around, rather than climbing or knuckle walking. We're going to also look at systemic changes in the skeleton, especially the feet, legs, pelvis, spine, and skull, that support that upright posture. Changes in teeth and jaws are really important as well, including the smaller front teeth, as well as thick enameled molars and faces that gradually become less projecting. Finally, there's the gradual expansion of brain size, especially once we get into the genus Homo. And alongside those anatomical changes, we see increasingly complex tool use and cultural behavior, which we can see through stone tools and later through art and symbolic objects. A really important takeaway for you is that big brains are not the first thing that happened. There's a popular cartoon version of human evolution where we sort of start as a little ape and then our bodies straighten up and our heads get bigger and bigger as we march toward modern humans. The fossil evidence does not actually support that simple story. Instead, it suggests that bipedalism and the skeletal changes that go with it appeared first, and that major brain expansion is a later development. So as we go through the rest of the lecture, I want you to keep this mental checklist. How is the species moving? What do its teeth and its jaws look like? What can we say about brain size? and what kind of tools or behaviors are associated with it, if any. That is essentially how we turn a collection of bones and stones into an evolutionary narrative. So let's dig deeper into bipedalism because it's one of the defining features of hominins and a central concept in this chapter as well as in your quiz. When we say that hominins are bipedal, we don't just mean that they can walk on two legs sometimes. Lots of animals can do that. Bears can stand upright, chimps can hobble around on 2 feet when they feel like it. What sets hominins apart is habitual bipedalism. Our bodies are structurally built so that walking on 2 legs is the default, efficient, everyday mode of locomotion. To make that possible, evolution had to essentially rewire the skeleton from top to bottom. We'll start with the feet and legs because that's where bipedalism, quite literally, hits the ground. In early hominins, we see feet that shift from being grasping structures, great for climbing and for grabbing branches, to being weight-bearing platforms. The heel bone becomes larger to absorb the impact of each step. The toes become shorter overall, and the big toe gradually moves into line with the others, losing its opposable thumb-like function. In a chimp, the big toe sticks off to the side and is used almost like a hand. In an obligate biped, the big toe is part of the rigid lever that pushes the body forward. The way humans transfer weight during walking is also really distinctive. As we take a step, the weight travels from the heel alongside the outside of the foot, across the ball, and then off the big toe. That pattern of movement, plus the arches in our feet, help us conserve energy and maintain stability with every step. If you think about how many steps you take in a day, or if you count them, having a mechanically efficient foot is a huge advantage. Okay, now for the legs. In bipeds, the legs are longer relative to the arms, which gives us a longer stride and makes walking a lot more efficient. The femur, or the thigh bone, angles inward from the hip to the knee. This inward angle brings the knees closer to the midline of the body, so that when you walk, your feet land more or less under your center of gravity, instead of way off to the side. That alignment is crucial for balance. It means you don't have to dramatically shift your hips from side to side with each step, the way that a chimp does when it tries to walk upright. When you put all of this together, each leg behaves somewhat like a pendulum, swinging from the hip socket. And once the leg is in motion, it takes relatively little muscular energy to keep it going. That pendulum effect is part of why human bipedal walking is surprisingly energy efficient over long distances, even though running is actually less efficient and more costly. Of course, you can't just stand up a chimp and expect everything to work. For full-time bipedalism, the pelvis, spine, and skull all have to be reconfigured as well. The human pelvis is short, it's broad, and it's bowl-shaped, with large hip joints and a broad sacrum. Compared to a quadruped pelvis, ours brings the vertebral column closer to the hip joints and creates more surface area for muscles and for ligaments to attach. That design, it helps stabilize the trunk when we're upright, especially when the entire weight of the body is temporarily supported by one leg during the walking cycle. This shape also has implications for childbirth. A broad, curved sacrum and a wider pelvic inlet and outlet increase the size of the birth canal. As brains get larger and newborn heads get bigger, the pelvis has to balance two competing demands. It has to remain efficient for walking and running, but it also has to allow infants to pass through. This tension is sometimes referred to as the obstetric dilemma and becomes more pronounced later in our evolutionary history. The spine plays a major role as well. Humans have a distinctive S-shaped spinal curve. The lumbar region, or lower back, curves inward, while the thoracic region, the mid-back, curves outward. This double curve brings the torso's center of mass over the pelvis and helps absorb shock during movement. In quadrupeds, the spine is more like a gently arched bridge suspended between the front and the back limbs. That configuration, it works for a horizontal body plan, but is really not ideal for an upright one. Then at the top of the spine, the skull also has to be repositioned. The crucial piece here is the foramen magnum, the large hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord enters. In quadrupeds, the foramen magnum is located toward the back of the skull because the head is held out in front of the body like a cantilevered weight or something. In habitual bipeds, the foramen magnum moves to a more central position on the base of the skull, which allows the head to balance on top of the spine. That change reduces the muscular effort that's needed to hold the head up and is one of the key indicators that paleoanthropologists use to infer bipedal posture from fossil skulls. Finally, we have teeth and brains, which are changing alongside the locomotor system. As hominins adapt to different diets and ways of processing food, we see back teeth, especially the molars, develop this thick enamel that's well suited for grinding and for crushing. At the same time, the front teeth, the incisors and the canines, usually get smaller and less specialized for slicing or tearing. Faces become less prognathic, meaning that the jaws don't jut forward as much, and the lower face gradually tucks in under the brain case. But again, the really important point for you to remember is that big brains come later. Early hominins had brain sizes comparable to chimps and other apes. The major increases in cranial capacity, like into the 600, 800, 1,000 cubic centimeter range and beyond, those don't show up until we get into the genus Homo, especially with species like Homo habilis and Homo erectus. So if you had to boil down this section into just one big idea, it would be this. We became upright walkers before we became big-brained humans. And that shift to habitual bipedalism required a full-body redesign from the toes all the way up to the way our heads are attached to our spines. Interesting, huh? Okay, now that we've talked about the how of bipedalism, let's zoom in on the who. Who are the earliest known hominins, and what do their fossils actually look like? All of the earliest candidates for hominins so far come from Central and Eastern Africa, which I've shown here on the slide, and they date to somewhere between about 7 and 4 million years ago. These species sit very close to the point where our lineage diverges from the ancestors of chimpanzees and bonobos. So they're really crucial for understanding what the earliest hominins were like, and just as importantly, what they were not like. The first of these is Sahelanthropus chidensis, nicknamed Tumai. Sahelanthropus lived around 7 to 6 million years ago in what is now Chad in Central Africa. We primarily have a fairly complete but distorted cranium, so there's still a lot we don't know about the body. Morphologically, Tumai has a very ape-like skull. It has a long, low brain case, a sloping face, and very robust brow bridges. The brain size is small, It's about 360 cubic centimeters, roughly in that chimpanzee range. But there are some intriguing features that look more hominin like canine teeth that are relatively small and not as projecting as we see in many apes. The midface is somewhat shorter. And most importantly, for our purposes, the foramen magnum appears to be positioned more underneath the skull than at the back. That more central placement suggests that the head might have been balanced on top of the spine in something closer to an upright posture. Because we lack postcranial bones, paleoanthropologists still debate just how bipedal this earliest hominin really was. But it's a strong candidate for an early hominin, and it already illustrates the theme of mixed traits. Next, we have Orrorin tuganensis, known from the Tugan Hills in Kenya, dating to about 6.2 to 5.6 million years ago. Here, we have fragments of the femur, as well as parts of arms, fingers, and teeth. The femur shows features such as the shape of the neck and the distribution of the cortical bone that are really consistent with bipedal locomotion. At the same time, the curved finger bones look very well suited for climbing. So Orrorin appears to have been a part-time biped, likely walking upright on the ground, but still spending a lot of time in trees. So again, we're seeing that mosaic, not a modern human on two legs, but an animal experimenting with a new way of using its body. Then we meet Ardipithecus, a genus that's represented by two species, Ardipithecus cadaba and Ardipithecus ramidus, nicknamed Ardi. Ardipithecus cadaba, dating to about 5.8 to 5.2 million years ago in Ethiopia, is known from teeth and limb fragments, including a toe bone, whose joint surfaces suggest upright walking. Yet, the rest of the anatomy that we have, especially the curved hand and foot bones, tell us that climbing was still important. Ardipithecus ramidus, at about 4.4 million years ago, is much better represented. We have over 100 different specimens, including a fairly complete female skeleton known as Ardi. Ardi had a small brain, about 350 cubic centimeters, very similar to that of a chimpanzee. The skull is elongated and the face slopes forward, so in that sense, she looks quite ape-like. But when we study the pelvis and the leg bones, we see a suite of features that suggest upright walking on the ground. At the same time, Ardi's feet tell a little bit of a different story. The big toe is still opposable, more like a thumb, and the other toes are curved, perfect for grasping branches. So Ardi gives us compelling evidence that some early hominins were already walking upright on the ground while still retaining significant arboreal adaptations. They weren't, quote, failed humans or, quote, proto-chimps. They were successful species with their own distinctive way of moving through and inhabiting their environment. All of these early hominins, the three that I've mentioned, are important because they show us that bipedal traits emerge first, and they do so in a really patchy, mosaic way. No single fossil suddenly appears with a full human body plan and a big brain. Instead, we see bits of the human pattern, slightly more forward foramen magnum, somewhat different femur, a pelvis that is starting to look more bowl-shaped, layering on top of other traits that still look very ape-like. As we move forward in time, around 4 million years ago, we encounter a new genus, Australopithecus, literally, quote, southern ape. This group dominates the hominin fossil record from about 4 million to 1.2 million years ago. And it is extremely important for understanding the foundations of our lineage. Australopithecines are clearly bipedal, but with a style of bipedalism that is not quite the same as our own. They're generally shorter than modern humans, typically standing somewhere between 1 and 1.5 meters tall, or roughly 3.3 to 4.9 feet. Their brains are still on the small side, on average about 35% the size of a modern human brain. They're more in line with modern gorillas or chimps than with us. If you were to meet one, for example, in a time machine, you would not mistake an Australopithecus for a modern human. And you wouldn't get them mixed up because their faces tend to be ape-like. Their foreheads are low, their jaws project forward in a way that we call prognathic, and the back teeth, especially the molars, are relatively large with thick enamel. This suggests that many Australopithecines were adapted to chewing tough, fibrous plant foods, things like roots, tubers, seeds, and perhaps gritty underground storage organs alongside fruit and leaves. From the neck down, though, their skeletons show a blend of human-like and ape-like traits. The pelvis and the lower limbs, they show strong evidence of habitual bipedalism. The femur bone angles inward toward the knee. The knee and the ankle joints are enlarged to bear weight, and the shape of the pelvis suggests an upright gait. At the same time, arms remain relatively long, and the finger and toe bones are still curved, indicating that climbing trees was still part of their locomotor repertoire. Dietarily, or for their diet, Australopithecines seem to have been ecological generalists. They ate a wide range of plant foods like fruits, leaves, seeds, and probably also insects and small animals, with some species perhaps incorporating scavenged meat into their diets. Their teeth and jaws were set up to handle variety, not to specialize narrowly on a single food type. This flexibility, it can help explain why the genus Australopithecus lasted for nearly 3 million years and gave rise to several different branches. One of the more important conceptual shifts that emerges from studying Australopithecines is the realization that there was not just one Australopithecus that gradually turned into Homo. Instead, we have a cluster of species: Australopithecus anamensis, afarensis, africanus, gari, sediba, and others, living in overlapping times and places, each with slightly different anatomical and ecological profiles. I want to go through a few of these just to give you an idea. So the first would be Australopithecus anamensis, which dates from around 4.2 million to 3.8 million years ago. It is the earliest known Australopithecus, has bipedal legs and feet, but curved hand bones. It also likely ate tough plant foods because it has large canines and thickly enameled molars. Then afarensis, which dates from around 3.9 to 2.8 million years ago. This is the famous Lucy species. It's found mostly in Ethiopia and Tanzania, and there's strong evidence here of habitual bipedalism. We see inward angled femur, a pelvis that's adapted for upright walking, and Laetoli footprints, dating from around 3.6 million years ago. And these footprints, they show a human-like stride without that divergent big toe. However, this species still had a curved finger and curved toe bones, as well as ape-like shoulders. So, meaning it walked, but it also climbed. Then we have Africanus, which dates from around 3.3 million to 2 million years ago. Africanus is found in South Africa. It's anatomically similar to Afarensis, but with slightly larger brains and a more rounded crania. We also have other types of Australopithecus, and these are listed in your textbook. They each add complexity to the picture, showing that overlapping species in similar regions and times existed, and they hint that Homo may have evolved from one branch, while others represent side branches. So, putting this another way, some of these lineages may have been evolutionary experiments that ended in sad extinction. Others likely fed into later branches, including the origin of Homo. This complexity is exactly why we keep returning to the mosaic or family bush metaphor rather than the idea of a line or a ladder. When you look at the fossil record in detail, it becomes very hard to sustain the idea of a single straight line of ancestors marching up towards us. Instead, you see multiple lineages branching, coexisting, and sometimes dying out, with only a few of those branches eventually leading to modern humans. So when you hear names like Sahelanthropus, or Ardipithecus, or Australopithecus, I want you to think less missing link and more cast of characters in a long-running, very messy evolutionary drama. Our job as anthropologists is to try to understand how each character fits into the broader story. Before we move on to Paranthropus and the earliest members of the genus Homo, I want to slow us down and give you a chance to practice thinking like a paleoanthropologist. Right now, it might feel like you're just being asked to memorize a lot of names and dates. But underneath all of that, the real intellectual work of paleoanthropology is about learning how to read bones as evidence, as clues in an argument about how a particular hominin lived. So here's our first reflection exercise. If you're watching this as a recording, which obviously you are, go ahead and pause the video after I finish giving the prompt and give yourself a few minutes to really think and write. If we were doing this together synchronously, I would ask you to jot some notes down and then we could share it out. But alas, we are separated, so please take notes and think on your own. So here's the prompt. Imagine that you are in a paleoanthropology lab. Someone hands you a single fossil femur and a fragment of pelvis from an unknown hominin species. You do not have the skull or the feet, just those pieces. What specific features would you examine to decide whether this species walked bipedally on a regular basis? How would you explain to a curious friend why those particular features matter for bipedalism? Try to be as concrete as you can. For example, you might think about the angle of the femur. Does it slant inward toward the knee, bringing the feet under the body's center of gravity, or not? You can think about the size and the shape of the knee joint. Does it look like it's built to bear weight during single leg support? Also, there's the overall shape of the pelvis. Is it short and bowl-shaped with broad iliac blades? Or is it long and narrow like a quadruped's? The size of the hip joint can also provide clues. Are the joint surfaces large enough to support upright posture? That's the question there. So if you want to get a little more speculative, you can also think back to the foramen magnum position that we discussed earlier and imagine what you would look for if you did have the skull. Is the head balanced on top of the spine, or is it slung out in front? On the second part of the prompt, about explaining this to a friend, really imagine talking to someone who has never taken an anthropology class. How would you translate this technical knowledge into plain, accessible language? You might say something like, Well, if the thigh bones angle inward and the hip and knee joints are big and reinforced, that tells us this animal spent a lot of time walking on two legs. But if the hips look more like a bowl than a long flat plate, that's another clue that the body was built to stand upright, because that shape helps support the organs and helps keep your balance. Take a few minutes, write down your thoughts. Don't worry about being perfect. The goal here is just to start noticing which anatomical details your brain grabs onto and to practice connecting form and function. When you're finished, unpause the recording and we'll move forward into the next branch of the hominin bush. Oops, I think I went forward too far. Let me go back. Nope, this is right. All right, so now that we've met the Australopithecines, let's turn to their heavy chewing cousins, the robust Australopithecines, usually classified in the genus Paranthropus. These hominin lived roughly between 2.7 and 1 million years ago, overlapping in time with some Australopithecus species and with early members of the genus Homo. The three main species you'll see in the textbook are Paranthropus ethiopicus, Paranthropus boisei, and Paranthropus robustus. Anatomically, Paranthropus looks like the power chewer branch of our family bush, and they share a suite of dramatic cranial traits. They have, for example, a prominent sagittal crest, which is a ridge of bone that runs along the top of the skull. If you imagine a mohawk made of bone, that's basically what a sagittal crest looks like. It provides extra surface area for the attachment of huge temporalis muscles, which are involved in chewing. Then massive molars with extremely thick enamel, especially in boisei, which has been nicknamed Nutcracker Man because of its enormous back teeth. Then there's broad, flaring cheekbones and a somewhat dish-shaped face, which makes space for those large chewing muscles to attach and expand. So these features together, they suggest a diet that relied heavily on tough, fibrous foods that require a lot of grinding and crushing. So things like grasses, sedges, roots, tubers, possibly hard-shelled nuts, and seeds. Even if they also ate softer foods when available, their anatomy is clearly built to handle the worst-case scenario, the food that is hardest to chew. More recent work, especially on Paranthropus robustus, has complicated the picture a little bit. So we see microwear on the teeth that suggests that they may have eaten a more varied diet than we once thought, including maybe fruits and other softer foods. But even so, the basic theme still stands. Paranthropus represents a highly specialized chewing adaptation. From the neck down, Paranthropus bodies look broadly similar to other hominins of the time. Bipedal, relatively small-bodied, likely still capable of some climbing. It's really in the skull and in the teeth that their specialization is most obvious. This specialization, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it allowed Paranthropus to exploit ecological niches that other hominins might not have been able to use as effectively, especially in times of environmental stress. On the other hand, being highly specialized can make a lineage vulnerable if the environment changes and that particular niche disappears. By around 1 million years ago, the robust Australopithecines are gone. They represent a side branch of our family bush that ultimately, sad, goes extinct. They are not our direct ancestors, but they're really important for showing how evolution in the hominin line did not move in a single direction toward more human like. Instead, it produced multiple experiments in body design and diet, some of which, like Paranthropus, are quite different from the path that eventually leads to us. So, when you see those skulls with giant molars and powerful jaws in the textbook photos, I want you to think this is one possible way to be a hominin: specialized, robust, and ultimately short-lived in evolutionary time. Okay, enter the genus Homo. With Paranthropus on one branch of the bush, we now follow another branch that leads us into the genus Homo, the group that eventually includes us. The earliest widely recognized species in this genus is Homo habilis, whose name means handyman. Habilis lived in East Africa, roughly between 2.4 and 1.4 million years ago. And it overlaps with both Australopithecines and robust forms like Paranthropus. Compared to Australopithecus, Habilis shows several important shifts. First, the brain is larger, averaging about 650 cubic centimeters, which is roughly 50% bigger than typical Australopithecine brains. Still smaller than ours, but clearly headed in that direction. The face, second, is less prognathic. It doesn't jut out as much, and the skull is somewhat more rounded. The teeth, especially the molars, are generally smaller and more similar to modern human teeth, suggesting some shifts in diet and food processing. The body is still relatively small, around 1.3 meters tall, with long arms relative to the legs, indicating that climbing may still have been part of the behavioral repertoire. One of the most important features of Habilis, and the reason for its nickname, handyman, is its hands. The bones of the hand show evidence of a precision grip, the ability to touch the thumb to the fingertips in a controlled way. That kind of grip is really crucial for making and for using stone tools. Homo habilis is associated with the Mode 1 stone tool industry, also known as the Oldowan tools. Oldowan tools are relatively simple. They're often just cores and flakes produced by striking one rock with another. But this simplicity is kind of deceptive. It takes skill and it takes planning to hit the stone at just the right angle and the right force to produce a sharp-edged flake. These tools, they're used for cutting meat, scraping hides, chopping plant material, and breaking bones to access bone marrow. When we look at animal bones that are found alongside Oldowan tools, we often see cut marks and percussion marks, which tells us that early Homo was using these tools to process carcasses. There's ongoing debate whether early Homo was mostly scavenging carcasses left behind by other predators, or whether they were doing some hunting themselves. But either way, it seems clear that meat and marrow became more important components of the diet, and that tools were central to accessing those resources. This is where we see a really important feedback loop begin to emerge. As hominins use tools to process food, they can get more calories and nutrients from a given environment. Those extra calories may support larger brains, which in turn allow for more complex tool making and so on. The details of that loop are still debated, but the general idea that tools, diet, and brain size are intertwined, that's a key concept in this chapter. There's still, though, considerable debate among paleoanthropologists about the exact boundaries of Homo habilis, whether some fossils should be reassigned to Australopithecus, or whether another species, Homo rudolfensis, should be recognized as distinct. For now, what matters in our course is that Homo habilis represents an early form of Homo, with a larger brain, more human-like teeth and face, and a clear association with stone tool use. From Homo habilis, we move to a species that marks a major turning point in our evolutionary history. That is Homo erectus. Homo erectus appears in Africa around 1.9 million years ago and persists in various regional forms until around 400,000 years ago, or even later in some areas. It's the first hominin we know of that truly spreads out of Africa and occupies a wide range of environments across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Anatomically, Homo erectus looks much more like us from the neck down. The body is taller and more linear, with long legs and shorter arms. And that's a configuration that supports long-distance walking and running. The skeleton suggests a relatively hairless body and a build that was adapted to heat dissipation, which fits with life in a more open, savanna-like environment. The skull, however, still looks pretty archaic. It is long and low, with thick cranial bones and very prominent brow ridges. The forehead is relatively flat, not high and rounded like ours. Brain size ranges from about 950 to about 1,150 cubic centimeters, so larger than Homo habilis, solidly in early Homo territory, but still on the low side compared to modern humans. Finally, the teeth are smaller and more human-like than those of earlier hominins, and the jaw is lighter and shorter. One of the most famous Homo erectus fossils is the Neriocotomy boy, found near Lake Turkana in Kenya. This nearly complete skeleton of a juvenile gives us a vivid sense of what actual Homo erectus individuals looked like in life. They were tall, slender, and very close to the modern human body proportions, even as the skull remains distinctively archaic. Behaviorally, Homo erectus is associated with the mode 2 stone tools, known as the Acheulean tools. Acheulean tools, they include bifacial hand axes, as well as cleavers, which are shaped and flaked on both sides to produce symmetrical, teardrop-like forms. Learning to make a good Acheulean hand axe requires planning, fine motor control, and social learning. You don't just accidentally bang out a perfect hand axe to use on your first try. This suggests that Homo erectus had more advanced cognitive abilities and perhaps more structured teaching within groups. There's also evidence, although it's sometimes debated, of controlled use of fire at some Homo erectus sites. Even if we set the fire question aside, though, the sheer geographic spread of Homo erectus tells us that these hominins were remarkably flexible and remarkably innovative in how they lived. They occupied open grasslands as well as wooded areas and forest edges. They handled different climates, and they likely had some form of cooperative hunting, or at least coordinated scavenging. In many ways, Homo erectus looks like the first hominin that we could reasonably imagine living a life that would feel familiar in its physical demands, moving long distances on foot, using tools on a daily basis, sharing food, and relying on group cooperation. It stands at the beginning of a really long trajectory that eventually leads to later archaic Homo and ultimately to us. As Homo erectus populations evolve over time and spread across continents, we begin to see a variety of archaic Homo forms, species that are more like us than Homo erectus, but not yet fully anatomically modern. These include fossils usually grouped as early archaic Homo sapiens or Homo heidelbergensis, and sometimes Homo rhodesiensis in Africa. These hominins appear roughly between 600,000 and 200,000 years ago in Africa, Europe, and Asia. Their brains are typically around 1,200 cubic centimeters, which falls at the lower end of the modern human range. Their skulls, they show a mix of ancestral and derived features. For example, they still have pronounced brow ridges and relatively low foreheads. Their faces are less projecting than Homo erectus, but more robust than ours. The back of the skull is not yet as rounded as in modern Homo sapiens. Behaviorally, these archaic Homo groups hunted large game, they used improved Acheulean tools, and likely built simple shelters as well. In colder regions, they probably even wore simple clothing, although direct evidence of clothing is very hard to find in the archaeological record. Into this already complex picture, Homo naledi adds another layer of surprise. Discovered in the Rising Star cave system in South Africa, Naledi lived roughly between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago, which means it overlapped in time with early modern humans in Africa. What makes Homo naledi so fascinating is its mosaic anatomy. It has a small brain, around 525 cubic centimeters, more similar in volume to Australopithecines than to modern humans. Its skull shape, however, is more Homo-like, with some features that resemble later members of our genus. The shoulders and the pelvis are more Australopithecus-like, suggesting that Homo naledi retained some primitive traits. The hands, the feet, and the legs look more modern Homo-like, with clear adaptations for bipedal walking as well as tool use. So here we have a species that is relatively young, living at a time when our own species is either emerging or already present in Africa, but that retains many features that we might otherwise associate with much older hominins. This reinforces a really key point. The genus Homo was not a neat linear sequence. Instead, it consisted of multiple coexisting lineages, some with advanced traits in one part of the body and more primitive traits in another. And some of these lineages almost certainly interacted and interbred. Others may have lived mostly in isolation. From a course perspective, what I want you to take away is the idea of mosaic humans. Hominins that look very human-like in some ways and very ancient in others. That mosaic pattern is a recurring theme in our fossil record, and it's a big reason why anthropologists are cautious about overly simple stories of progress. We now arrive at one of the most recognizable groups in our evolutionary story, the Neanderthals, or Homo neanderthalensis. Neanderthals emerge as a distinct group about 200,000 years ago, with Neanderthal-like traits developing by about 430,000 years ago. They lived primarily in Europe and in Western Asia, and they were especially well adapted to cold, glacial-like environments. Anatomically, Neanderthals have a look that is quite different from ours, but still unmistakably human. Their bodies are stocky and robust, with shorter limbs relative to torso size. This body plan reduces surface area and conserves heat, which is clearly an advantage in cold climates. Their skulls are long and low, with occipital buns, or a bulge at the back of the skull, very strong brow ridges, and large nasal openings. The large noses may have helped warm and humidify the cold, dry air that they were exposed to. Their front teeth are relatively large and often show heavy wear patterns that suggest that they were used as tools, as clamping and gripping objects that the hands then manipulated. Their brains are large, often in the range of 1,500 cubic centimeters, so overlapping with and sometimes even exceeding the average brain size of modern humans. Behaviorally, Neanderthals are associated with the Mode 3 stone tool tradition called Mousterian, which uses the Levallois prepared core technique. This technique, it involves carefully shaping a stone core so that a single strike produces a flake of a predetermined shape. It requires planning, coordination, and skill, indicating substantial cognitive sophistication. Neanderthals were skilled big game hunters as well. They lived in small, mobile groups that followed herds of animals like mammoth, bison, and deer. Evidence from their skeletons shows many healed fractures and injuries, suggesting that they took care of their sick and their injured group members. That is a powerful indication of social care and mutual dependence. There's also increasing evidence that Neanderthals engaged in forms of symbolic behavior. We have probable burials, possible personal ornaments like beads, and even cave art and engraved objects that some researchers attribute to Neanderthal activity. While there is still debate over how widespread and how complex Neanderthal symbolic life was, it's clear that they were not the brutish, dull-witted caricatures that they were once made out to be. Genetically, Neanderthals are a side branch, not our direct ancestors. However, and this is crucial for the assimilation model we'll talk about later, they did interbreed with early modern Homo sapiens. Most present-day people of non-African descent carry about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. Amazing. And that genetic legacy, it impacts traits ranging from immune function to skin and hair characteristics. So, Neanderthals are best understood as our cold-adapted cousins, close relatives with whom we share common ancestors, common environments, and in some cases, the same bed. Their existence makes it impossible to think of Homo sapiens as the only real humans especially in the late Pleistocene. We were one human species among several, and that's the point. Neanderthals, however, were not the only humans sharing the planet with us. Another group, known as the Denisovans, is primarily identified through DNA and a small number of bones and teeth found in places like Siberia, Tibet, and Southeast Asia. Genetically, Denisovans appear to be a sister group to the Neanderthals. They split from the same ancestral population at some point after the line leading to modern humans diverged. What's remarkable is that Denisovans also interbred with modern humans, particularly with populations in parts of Asia and Oceania. Some groups today carry Denisovan-derived genes that appear to help with high-altitude adaptation, particularly in low-oxygen environments like the Tibetan Plateau. This is another strong piece of evidence for admixture between modern humans and archaic populations. In addition to Neanderthals and Denisovans, we have the so-called island hominins. Homo floresiensis. Let me say that again. Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit, comes from the island of Flores in Indonesia. These hominins, they lived roughly between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, and they were strikingly small-bodied, with adult heights around 1 meter. Their brains were also small, much smaller than ours. Yet they used stone tools and they used fire. Their anatomy shows a mix of primitive and derived traits, and their small size is often interpreted as insular dwarfism, or an evolutionary response to limited resources and the absence of large predators on islands. Another species, Homo luzonensis, was discovered on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, and it dates to about 67,000 to 50,000 years ago. Like Floresiensis, it shows a mosaic of traits: small body size, curved foot bones that suggest climbing, and other features that don't fit neatly into our existing categories. When you put Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the island hominins together, a very different picture of the late Pleistocene emerges. Instead of a solitary Homo sapiens wandering alone across the globe, we see a very crowded human past, where multiple human species coexist in different regions. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in parts of Asia, island hominins on places like Flores and Luzon, and anatomically modern Homo sapiens emerging and spreading out of Africa. Some of these groups interacted and interbred. Others may have remained more isolated. But the big takeaway is that we are the last surviving branch, but not the only branch that ever existed. Now we turn, finally, squarely to us, anatomically modern Homo sapiens. The earliest fossils that look clearly modern come from Africa and date to roughly 300,000 to 200,000 years ago. Over time, Homo sapiens populations spread into Asia, then into Europe by around 35,000 years ago, and eventually into Oceania and the Americas. Anatomically, modern humans have a distinct set of features. They have a rounded skull with a high forehead, reduced brow ridges compared to Neanderthals and earlier archaic Homo. They don't have an occipital bun, so the back of the skull is more globular. There's a protruding chin, called a mental eminence, which is unique among hominins, and long legs relative to arms, and a generally slender skeleton, especially in the earlier tropical populations. Behaviorally, we see early hints of symbolic culture in Africa around 125,000 to 100,000 years ago. We found pieces of engraved ochre, shell beads, and other objects that appear to have been used for symbolic communication or maybe social signaling. These early traces suggest that the cognitive and cultural capacities associated with modern humans were emerging well before they became visually spectacular in the archaeological record. By around 40,000 years ago, especially in Europe, but also in other regions, there's a dramatic expansion in material culture. We start to find things like elaborate cave paintings and rock art. We find carved figurines, including the famous Venus figures, musical instruments like bone flutes. We also find complex hearths, kilns, and early evidence of textiles, and more formal burials with grave goods that likely express social identities and beliefs about death. Some scholars call this Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or a cultural explosion, while others argue that the changes were more gradual and that we see important precursors in earlier African contexts as well. So there's ongoing debate about whether anatomical modernity and behavioral modernity emerge together, or whether there's kind of a lag. That is, bodies that look like ours start appearing before the full suite of complex symbolic behaviors. For our purposes, the important point is that by the late Pleistocene, Homo sapiens is clearly engaging in rich, symbolic, technological, and social practices. The combination of anatomical traits and behavioral complexity sets us apart from earlier hominins, and it obviously contributes to our eventual global success. To tie together anatomy, cognition, and behavior, it's really helpful to revisit the stone tool traditions that run alongside this whole story of evolution. The earliest tools we know of are the Lomekwian tools, dating to about 3.3 million years ago in Kenya. These are large, crude cores and flakes, as shown on the slide. We're not sure exactly who made them, possibly Australopithecines, but they show that stone tool use predates Homo. Next comes Mode 1, or Oldowan tools, which appear around 2.6 million years ago and last until about 1.7 million years ago. These include simple choppers, flakes, and cores. They're associated with Homo habilis and other early Homo species. And despite their apparent simplicity, Oldowan tools mark a huge leap in cognitive and manual skill and are used for cutting, scraping, and pounding, especially in the context of processing carcasses. Then we move to Mode 2, or the Acheulean tools, beginning about 1.7 million years ago and continuing until about 160,000 years ago. Acheulean tools are characterized by bifacial hand axes and cleavers that are shaped on both sides and are often symmetrical. These are associated with Homo erectus and early archaic Homo sapiens. Acheulean technology requires multi-step planning and a mental template of the desired form, so that suggests a significant increase in cognitive complexity. Then Mode 3, or the Mousterian tools. They're associated primarily with Neanderthals and with some contemporaneous Homo groups between about 300,000 and 40,000 years ago. The Mousterian industry makes extensive use of the Levallois prepared core technique. And that is basically a technique where a core is carefully shaped so that one or a few well-placed blows will produce flakes of predictable size and predictable shape. This method allows for a really diverse toolkit. It allows for scrapers, points, blades, all from a single core. And it reflects really sophisticated planning and efficiency. Finally, Modes 4 and 5 correspond to upper Paleolithic industries like the Aurignacian and Magdalenian, associated mainly with modern Homo sapiens. Here, we see long, thin blades and tiny microliths used in composite tools, for example, that are inset into wooden shafts. We also see a broad expansion in materials. They're using bone, antler, ivory, shell alongside stone, and a close association with the explosion of art and symbolic culture that we discussed earlier. Across these tool traditions, we see a clear trend: increasing standardization, efficiency, diversity of tool types, and use of new materials. Each step reflects changes in hand anatomy and in brain size, and crucially, in the social transmission of knowledge. Tool traditions are not just individual inventions. They're maintained and elaborated through teaching and learning, which is really central to what makes human cultures so powerful. So with the cast of characters and now the tool traditions laid out, we can return to the big question. How did modern Homo sapiens emerge, and what happened to everyone else? Anthropologists often frame this in terms of three main models: the replacement model, aka the out of Africa model, multi-regional continuity model, and the assimilation model. The replacement or out of Africa model proposes that modern humans evolved in Africa and then spread out into Europe, Asia, and beyond between roughly 120,000 and 100,000 years ago. According to the strong version of this model, wherever these modern humans went, They replaced local archaic populations, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others, with little or no interbreeding. In this view, modern humans are essentially an African origin population that radiated outward and took over. Then there's the multi-regional continuity model, which offers a very different story. It suggests that modern humans evolved simultaneously from archaic populations in Africa, Europe, and Asia over the last 1.8 million years, with continuous gene flow connecting these regional populations. According to this model, local archaic populations gradually transformed into local modern populations. And the reason we're one species today is that gene flow kept everyone connected enough to prevent speciation. Then there's the assimilation model, which currently has the strongest support. And it combines elements of both the former two models. It proposes that modern Homo sapiens evolved first in Africa and then spread outward from Africa into other regions. As these populations moved into Europe, Asia, and elsewhere, they encountered local archaic groups such as Neanderthals and Denisovans. Instead of completely replacing them or evolving entirely separately, modern humans interbred with these groups. Within Africa itself, multiple Homo sapien subpopulations also interacted and exchanged genes over long periods. The assimilation model is supported by three key lines of evidence. The first is the oldest anatomically modern human fossils, which are found in Africa. The second is that there is some regional continuity in certain morphological traits, which hints at local contributions to modern variation. Most importantly, genetic data show clear signals of interbreeding between modern humans and archaic populations. So, in other words, the story is not pure replacement. It's not equal parallel evolution in every region. It's African origins plus later admixture. A much more entangled hybrid story. Genetics has given us some of the most compelling evidence for the assimilation model. So let's start with mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Mitochondria are the energy-producing organelles in cells, and they have their own small genomes that are inherited strictly from the mother. Because mtDNA doesn't recombine in the same way nuclear DNA does, changes in mtDNA lineages mainly accumulate through mutations over time. When researchers trace mtDNA variation in living humans backward, all the lines eventually converge on a material ancestral population, often referred to, somewhat misleadingly, as mitochondrial Eve, or the mtDNA most recent common ancestor. The data place this mtDNA in Africa roughly 200,000 to 150,000 years ago. We see something similar with the Y chromosome, which traces the paternal line. The so-called Y chromosomal atom, the Y chromosome most recent common ancestor, also appears to have lived in Africa, probably in Central Africa, somewhere between 275,000 and 200,000 years ago. It's crucial to emphasize that mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam were not the only humans alive at their respective times. They were simply individuals whose particular mtDNA or Y chromosome lineages are the ones that survived in modern populations. Many other lineages have gone extinct over time. Beyond these specific lineages, we can look at overall patterns of genetic variation. We find that Africa has the highest genetic diversity of any region, which suggests the longest and most continuous population history there. Populations outside Africa carry only a subset of that diversity, consistent with relatively recent migrations out of Africa. On top of that, Genome-wide studies have shown that many non-African populations carry Neanderthal-derived DNA, and some populations carry Denisovan-derived DNA as well. These segments are not random. Some are associated with immune function, skin and hair traits, or high altitude adaptation. That is direct evidence of admixture, or ancient interbreeding between Homo sapiens and other hominin groups. Taken together, these genetic patterns, they support a scenario in which modern Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, then spread out to other parts of the world, and then interbred with local archaic populations along the way, while retaining a deeply African origin and a relatively recent common ancestry as one species. So when we say we're all related, that is not just a feel-good slogan. It is a literal statement about the shared genealogical history of Homo sapiens, a history that includes African roots and archaic entanglements. So we've now covered a lot of ground, millions of years worth, to be precise. So before I close, I just want to invite you to step back and think about how all of the pieces fit together, not just as a sequence of species, but as a story about who we are. So here's your final reflection prompt for this lecture. Again, if you're watching the recording, go ahead and pause after the prompt and give yourself a few minutes to write. Okay, here's the prompt. For most of the last few 100,000 years, Homo sapiens shared the planet with other human species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, small-bodied island hominins like Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis. How does the idea of a family bush instead of a single family tree or ladder change your understanding of human uniqueness or human identity? And if you had to explain the assimilation model of our origins to a non-anthropologist friend in just a few sentences, how would you do it? Try to include at least one piece of genetic evidence. For example, mitochondrial DNA, Neanderthal DNA, or Denisovan DNA in your explanation. You might think in terms of questions like, does knowing that we once had cousin species make you feel more or less special as a human? How does it change your sense of what being human means if that category once included Neanderthals and other hominins? And what does it mean to say that we are African in origin but carry Neanderthal and Denisovan genes? Take 5 minutes, jot down your thoughts. You don't need to write a full essay, just try to articulate your ideas clearly and concretely, using at least some of the concepts and vocab from this lecture. As we wrap up, let's briefly recap the key points here. First point is that hominin evolution is not a straight ladder. It is a branching bush with many species, some of which go extinct and some of which contribute to our lineage. One of the earliest and most important changes is habitual bipedalism, which rewires the entire skeleton from feet and legs to pelvis, spine, and skull. Teeth, jaws, and diets also shift, with some lineages specializing in heavy chewing, like Paranthropus, and others becoming more flexible. Brains expand gradually, particularly in the genus Homo. And this expansion is tightly linked to changes in tool use as well as in diet and social learning. For most of our history, Homo sapiens coexisted with other human species, like Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the island hominins, and in some cases, we interbred with them. The assimilation model, supported by fossil and genetic evidence, tells us that we are a species with deep African roots, a history of global migration, and a genome that carries traces of encounters with other humans. You are now in a very strong position for the Module 5 reading quiz, and more importantly, for connecting this deep time story of human evolution with the later parts of the course. where we will explore contemporary human biological variation and eventually the cultural, social, and political dimensions of what it means to be human today. Thanks for staying with this very long journey through our very ancient and very crowded family bush. Thanks, guys.